My dog is at home though. She's lonely, you know. So I'm going to talk today about JSON REST APIs, part 1 of 2. Part 1 is all about the theory, and part 2 is going to be some actual practical application. I work for a company called Cuddly. My name is Steve Tauber. I'm the technical co-founder of Cuddly. We just put a dating app into open beta. You can download it right now in the Android store. I have some stickers if you want them with this really cool logo. And also, if you want to learn technical English, your company can hire me for your dev team. And after we sign NDAs, I can come in and just talk with your team for an hour, and hopefully you get better at technical English. So the contents of my talk are verbs, nouns, RESTful design techniques, and API logic in an MVC environment. Part 2 is going to deal with authentication, versioning, security, and actual responses. So that's what's in store for today. Let's talk about some vocabulary. The big word that we have to learn today is idempotent, or sometimes people say idempotent if you're British. What idempotent means is that multiple requests will have the same outcome. So if you have A equals 1, you can run that 1,000 times, and A will always be equal to 1. So that's an idempotent function. A++ is not idempotent because it actually modifies it. If you run it 5, 10, 15 times, you're going to have a different result every time. The next thing that when you're working with REST APIs is certain calls are safe versus not safe. Safe means that it's not going to make any changes. And when we're talking about REST has a bunch of properties that define what is RESTful or not RESTful. A lot of APIs are not fully REST compliant, and the reason you do that is because it's just way easier. These are all the properties of REST, so client-server communication, which is kind of pretty much the default when you're dealing with web products. Scalable, cacheable, layered approach, that all has to do with the ability to expand the technology very quickly. So if you're running massive web servers, you need to be able to make your responses very quickly. If you get an influx of traffic, you need to spin up new API boxes. And so you have that layered approach. Stateless is probably the property of REST that is most often ignored. So with stateless interaction between an API server and a client, that means that you have to have authentication on every single request. You can't use cookies to maintain session data, anything like that. So that's pretty annoying, especially with complex web applications. So a lot of times APIs are going to just ignore that and send a cookie back, which makes testing of the API more difficult. And then uniform interface has to do with the way that your resources are defined. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So there's 4 sub-properties for that. One of them being you're sending MIME types back when you're returning data. And this thing called HATE-OAS, which has to do with your API should have a single entry point. And as you're making requests, you discover more ways to access the API. And this is something that is often ignored in today's web services because you want to have a defined API that you can just give out to people, and developers are going to know how to use it in all the cases. HATE-OAS allows you to change your URLs at any time, and that's a problem if you're working with other developers because then they have to enumerate your API every time. Also, if you're doing things like using JSON or XML, you can't use HATE-OAS because you can't define what the next links are through JSON, at least very easily. So a lot of times that's ignored as well. Any questions so far? You should be asking one question, which is, I didn't define JSON, but hopefully all of you know what that is, but it's just JavaScript notation of objects. Verbs. Does anyone know the Hcp verbs? If you can get them all right, I'll give you guys 2 guesses. If you get them all right, I'll buy you a drink at Colding. Who knows? No? No guesses?
Get, put, post, fetch, options, head, what the, delete, yeah.
delete. You're missing some. Get, head, put, post, delete options. Patch, trace, and connect are all the HTTP. Okay. Trace and connect aren't used with REST. Trace has to do with debugging HTTP connections. Connect has to do with proxying. All the rest can be used by REST. You don't have to have all of them. They can also be correlated with CRUD somewhat. It's an oversimplification, but it's useful to make that comparison. And then we have two columns for which ones are safe and which ones are idempotent. So get and head are read commands. They're safe because they're never going to change data. Head just returns your headers, never body. Get is the full get request. Put and post are the two most complicated out of all of these because everyone argues about when you should use put and when you should use post. Per documentation standards, put is when you're creating a resource or you're replacing an existing resource. So an example would be like article/12. If you put to article/12, it's going to create it if it doesn't exist, or it's going to update the existing one and fully replace with whatever is in the body of the put request. Posting is going to create a new resource. So you would post to, for instance, /articles. Notice there's no ID there. And so that's going to allow the server to give you your ID. Whereas put, you have to know your ID. If you put on /articles, it's going to replace the entire collection with whatever you give it. So people don't really use put that often, but you can use it. Or they will use put when they actually mean to use patch. Patch is when you're updating partially. So let's say you have a user at /users, and you want to update that user's last name. You should send patch and have the body contain the new last name. However, most people use put. So we can already see things are starting to get complicated between put, post, and patch. It really doesn't matter what you use as long as you're consistent and as long as you document it. Delete is pretty self-explanatory. It's for getting rid of whatever resource you're working on. And options is useful for determining if you have, let's say, /articles, you can throw options at it and it will tell you which of the verbs are allowed on that particular resource. So it's a good way to explore an API that you don't have the full documentation on. You can also use it for enumerating certain properties of a resource, and I'll get into that a little bit later. It has to do with if you have fields that are the type of enumeration, then you can figure out what are the valid enumerated types that you can put in there. So. Let's talk about nouns. So the first thing is make them plural. And the reason is because we want to have consistency. That's part of one of the RESTful properties is we want consistency, unified interface. So even if you're using, you have like, let's say, one article that you're working on, your URL would still be articles/ID. So you can see that right here. That's just consistent. You don't want /articles sometimes and /article at other times because you might forget, which one to use. It's more complicated for unit testing, things like that. You never want to use verbs for nouns. That's a really common thing that I see people do. And there's arguments about this, but in my opinion, you shouldn't do it. So all of your objects, all of your URLs, you want nouns. You never want to have verbs. And the reason is because which of those verbs that we talked about, the Hcp verbs, what would you think are valid on this URL? What if you get this? What happens? Is that valid? Well, get is a safe HTTP verb. So in theory, nothing should happen if you get this. But you would expect, if you're making a call there, that publish is actually changing something on the back end. So that's why you don't want verbs inside your URLs. And Martin Fowler, EverWise, says there are two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off-by-one errors. So naming things is really, really important when it comes to nouns. That's what you're going to spend most of your time on when you're building a REST API, is figuring out exactly how you want to name things, exactly the structure of the items that you want. And that gets us into RESTful design techniques. Nouns are not your DB objects. So one of the first mistakes you're going to make is you're going to have your schema in your database, and you're going to want to create an endpoint for every item in the database, and you should not do that. You want to use logical user, what's the word I'm looking for? The user test cases, I suppose, where you're thinking as the user and seeing, okay, what is the user going to do? And that's how you're going to define your nouns. And you also want to plan for the future when you're doing that. So I had a situation where I had a bunch of messages, and two people were communicating, and they owned this list of messages. So in the database, I had an object that would track this and have things like the last message sent, timestamp, if there's unread messages, things like that. So do you think I should call that model discussions or conversations? What do you guys think? Who thinks discussions? And who thinks conversations? Okay, so 3 votes for conversations, no votes for discussions. Well, what I ended up doing was calling it discussions, and the reason is because we had to do some marketing stuff, and marketing people use a term called conversions, which is where the user's doing what you want them to do, for instance, buy a product. So I started originally with conversations, which was more natural for me, and then we ended up having conversions. So then I had this code that was like conversations versus conversions. It was really confusing. Both terms looked very similar. So then I had to go through and rename everything to discussions, which was really easy because I wrote unit tests, but it could have been a pain in the ass. So you want to make sure you plan for the future when you're choosing your nouns. You want to make sure you write a spec ahead of time. Miro talked about this a little bit, where with his unit testing, you want to kind of flesh this out, kind of think about all the different cases that you're going to have, and it's just going to make your design that much better. Once you publish an API, they're extremely hard to change. And so if you have cases that you haven't thought of, and maybe you have like version 1, version 2, version 3, and we'll get into how you version it later on. If you make a mistake, it's really hard to undo it if that API is public. And so writing the spec ahead of time is really good because you're gonna prevent those errors. Your API should also be self-contained, and this is what I was talking about before with the options call. So if you have something that takes integers as the params, you want to make sure that you use strings instead. So an example is you could have marital status, and inside your model, you probably have this defined as an int, or stored in the database as an int. So you have like single, widowed, dating someone, married, other, right? So you have 5 ints that represent that. If someone's using your API, you don't want them to have to send an integer because they're not going to know what that means. So you want a string, you want strings defined for what those options are. And so your API should take that string in, process it, convert it to the integer so that the model can store it. You also never want to trust anyone. Whenever someone is sending you information to your API, you need to just validate it, test it. They're going to try to do things like reset a password on a banned user account, for instance. And if you have that set up in an API, you need to do testing to make sure that the account is in a valid state before you do a reset password, for instance. So, and then of course, unit test. You should, if you're doing it in PHP, I recommend PHP unit. It's built into PHP Storm, and because it's an API, it's actually a lot easier to test than when you're working with most front-end web stuff, because it doesn't matter if there's like JavaScript or HTML or whatever. It's just, here's the JSON, you use fixtures to set up your database, you make the request, and then you just check if the things change properly and if the JSON response is the same. As far as camel case and snake case, I just go with however your particular framework is going to return the the data. It doesn't matter too much in JSON. There's some studies that say that snake case is 20% more readable. So if you can do snake case, maybe you can. Maybe you should choose that. I personally like camel case because it's consistent with my variables inside PHP. So, any questions so far? I know we're cruising through this. Yeah.
Regarding the spec, do you have something to recommend, some tool or specific?
Microsoft Word is what I use for writing my spec. Joel on Software has a great article about how to write a spec, how to maintain the spec, what rules you should have for what goes in the spec, who is updating the spec. So I would definitely check that out. Generally, you want to be explicit with the edge cases, because if you have 10 million users, every edge case is going to be hit by 5,000 people, let's say. So you want to make sure that your spec covers all of those nitty-gritty details. And this will help you when you're working with clients too, because 5 months down the road, your client's going to come back and say, oh, we want to add this feature. And you go, oh, not in the spec. And here's where you signed on every single page, and here's where you signed at the bottom. And if you're not having your client's initial specs, you should definitely start that tomorrow, because that's going to save your ass. Does that answer your question? I don't know if that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking about the actual implementation framework for the API. API or.
Yeah. I wrote my own actually, because there wasn't a good one that I found initially. There's some that, as you write your code, it'll write the documentation for you, much like PHP doc does, or JS doc, or whatever you use. But I think you should have the documentation before you write your code. So there's not many good tools that do that right now. There's some open source ones. I'm trying to remember who. I was doing some research and I found a really good. I can't remember what it's called though. So I'll. I don't know. Maybe I'll email it out or something. But yeah, there's only a couple good ones if you just search for JSON API documentator, something like that. Okay, so how do you do API? How do you do this inside an MVC? So the best way to do it is follow your standard MVC principle, fat models. You want super thin controllers. You want all of the business logic to be inside the model. And you actually don't need views at all. If you do this right, you will never have to write a view. So inside, I use CakePHP. Inside my app controller, I have in the render function, I have this request handler render as this JSON. That's it. I have no views in my entire API. So this will cut down your development time, maybe. And the other thing you want to do is use HTTP exceptions. You might have to add some to your MVC framework. Like I had to add 3 or 4 to CakePHP. There's a bunch that are already defined as add-ons to HTTP spec. So there's probably one that for your situation you can find it and it applies. There's even weird ones like I am a teapot. So that's an actual HTTP exception that you can throw. Twitter and Facebook kind of do things different sometimes, and Google. They all kind of do their own thing, but there's some handy ones like conflict exception, which is like everything that the client sent you is valid and you've received it, but maybe things in the database aren't in the correct state to do what they want to do. So for instance, changing the password on a disabled account or a banned account. I would throw a conflict exception for that because although they sent me all the correct parameters, everything's in the right format, they're authenticated, that doesn't make any sense, so I'm not going to do it. Okay, so let's talk about why you should use REST API every single day, no matter what. So this is a really common server setup. You've got your desktop and laptop computers talking to the server. Server talks to the database. Does anyone see any flaws in here? I see a huge flaw. What happens when the client comes to you and say, I want an Android app, or I want an iOS app, which is really common, right? So now you have a problem because now you have to write views for this new device, or you have to do some logic to figure out maybe the content appears differently. It's just a big pain in the butt. However, if you have a JSON API server, then your Android app can use REST JSON directly to the API server, and then your front-end server can use REST JSON directly to the API server, and then it serves up content in whichever format you want. So if you started with this left-hand side, it would be very easy to add on the mobile. And when it comes to unit testing, as Miro said, BHAT doesn't really work for REST JSON or for JSON APIs. If you test all this in CakePHP, all of your business logic is self-contained, and then your front-end server can do whatever testing it needs to do, entirely separate. If you have Android, you can do unit testing on that code completely separate. So whenever you make changes here, you can make sure that your interface between these other servers isn't changing. And if you have front-end people changing stuff, you know it's not going to affect any logic on the back end. So you can keep all that stuff separate and segmented, and it's going to protect your code. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
You mentioned at the beginning that HCP is not possible with JSON.
It's
yeah. There is a simple solution. There is actually a specification called JSON API,
yeah,
which defines lengths and relations, so it's possible to do that as well.
Yeah, so there's starting to be technology that does it. A lot of times with JSON, you want to return just your objects that you're working with, instead of having metadata like pagination and things like that. So there's some argument there as far as like what should be in your response body. It's technically possible, but I think that requirement is kind of going away just because people very rarely are using the hypertext engine as kind of the main thing right now. You have many more APIs where you need access to all the endpoints all the time, so that breaks the whole single entry point aspect of REST. And then the other thing is if you have mobile devices, or anything else, like for instance AJAX stuff, you're not actually going to get hyper HTML back out of the REST server. You're getting back JSON. So I don't know. I don't really abide by that, I suppose, but technically you're supposed to. That's why most APIs are REST-ish instead of completely RESTful. Any other questions? So next time, or not next time, but sometime in the future, I'll do part 2, which involves how do you secure this stuff? How do you do authentication? Maybe sometime instead of doing a put, you'll do a post instead, for good reasons, for obfuscating user data, things like that. Oh yeah, I forgot. Always use SSL when you have your own API, so that people can't figure out what's going on, or as easily figure out what's going on. Oh yeah, and versioning. Versioning is a big pain in the butt, so we'll talk about that next time also. Let's go drink.
Okay.